Hello, and you're very welcome to Adapt Radio. My name is Dr. Claire O'Connell, and today we're talking about AI and keeping our digital legacies.
From the Adapt Centre at Trinity College, this is Adapt Radio, presenting groundbreaking innovations, one conversation at a time.
Now, it's not something that many of us like to think about, but someday in the future will not be here. And it's likely that many of the things that we put into the digital world, our social media posts, our emails, texts, photos, documents, those will still be here. They will outlive us. And our guest on the podcast today thinks a lot about this. Danny Snow is a PhD candidate at University College Dublin School of Information and Communication Studies, and Danny is looking at human data interactions and AI. And that includes exploring the concept of digital literacy and examining how digital content is managed, preserved and accessed after a person dies. So Danny, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
I have to say, it's a slightly weird feeling that all this online and digital information will likely outlive us. But can you tell us what our digital legacy is and why it's important that we think about it now?
Well, it's in one way very simple, that it's digital information that is available about someone following their death. But obviously, at the moment, we're at a bit of an inflection point as more and more data is collected. What that actually means and the volume of that data and what it says about us is changing and will continue to change, as death is age related a lot of the time. So in more recent history, the volume of data is related to a specific period of time, whereas as we move forward, it's likely to relate to the entirety of someone's life.
And I mean, I suppose it strikes me that we're going to be dealing more and more with this as the world moves on. Why is it important that we need to think about it now rather than just sort of leave things to chance after we're gone?
Well, there's quite a specific reason, is the legality of it. So there's lots of discussions around personal data, and we understand that. We understand privacy maybe in relation to GDPR, but the definition of personal data is information relating to a living person. So, and this is in most jurisdictions. So legally, once you die, that data is no longer classed as personal data and isn't subject to the same regulations.
So you need to make the decisions about it while you're here.
Well, it's not even that. It's that once you die, there isn't the protections. So the decisions, you don't have an opportunity afterwards. There's no protections in place for it. What that means, it might be a lot of the time kind of irrelevant. A lot of people would have the attitude of, sure, I'm dead. I won't care. But we have to also understand that data is sticky, and personal data, even when alive, doesn't relate just to you. It relates to your family, anyone you're interacting with, anyone you're in the same location as, and it's the aggregation of that data that is important.
Okay, so I mean, let's think about some practicalities here. When someone dies, who owns that information left in their wake, and how does their family, their loved ones navigate any inheritance of, say, digital assets?
Well, this is where there's kind of two key aspects to this, is access and ownership. And it gets into what we actually think about that data. So do we see it as a property, similar to a physical object? If you leave something in your will, whether it be a chair or a house or whatever, it's transferable. But when we think about data, it becomes more complex, because it's the separation of, it can be viewed as that kind of physical thing that's transferable, but you can also take it from, say, like Floridi's view of an informational body about what that data actually means, and is it more akin to the actual body of the person. So if you have genetic information, if you have the narrative of that person over a lifetime, they exist as an informational body, which maybe isn't something that can be just transferred and assigned ownership of, and then comes with certain ethical obligations around the dignity over that informational body.
So on a very practical level, though, when somebody has passed on, what do the families have to do to even know what's there?
Well, this is maybe why we need to start thinking about it during life. Personally, I don't know how many accounts I have in various platforms or things I've signed up to and forgotten about and all those things. And a lot of them are irrelevant. A lot of those services will not exist. And maybe that's not important in terms of access to social media and stuff. All the big companies have like legacy contacts who can, like Apple or Google or Facebook there's options to assign someone to look after. But that also comes with issues around what within that data would you want to share and who you'd want to share it with. Because unfortunately, there are darker sides to this. If you think of next of kin, so if someone's married, there was a case where the family wasn't granted access. They just wanted access to photos via Facebook. But if you memorialize something, you pause it. And there are situations where people within that memorialized profile may have been, in one case, this was literally the murderer of the person, not to take it to too dark a space, but these things exist. And if it's just a neat little, this is a memorialized paused profile and it is there as a remembrance, there's no further context to it. And you don't have the option of removing or adding. And so there's lots of complexities can arise.
So Danny, tell us a little more about the ethical and legal challenges around this posthumous access of someone's data.
Well, I guess it comes into the different use cases for it. And I think this is where we think about personal data and we think of a very tight-knit circle around it. And maybe there's different ethical obligations when you're dealing with family and sensitivities, but also then we have to think of the possibilities of that data as well on a societal level. So it really does go from the personal, how it can affect your family and closer relationships, to the utility of that data potentially in, for example, your medical records going out. So it's from, sometimes we can just get focused in on the sort of the social media and our day-to-day kind of things that's very visible to us, but that data is much more expansive. And this is really how I sort of ended up in this area. I was thinking of the data life cycle, which is typically presented as a very technical thing. And then you start realizing it's so unruly, but also very sticky, and it has so many implications. And when it comes into pattern recognition, what's it saying and what's it doing? So there's very different ethical implications depending on the uses of it.
And where does AI come into this? Because you mentioned there that the volume of data and posthumous data is only increasing. And how is AI affecting or shaping our digital legacies of the future?
Well, when you think of the data that we create, and then once you die, that becomes a final kind of data set in a way. And if that's used to train models, that becomes embedded within it, and there isn't the negotiation in there. As mentioned earlier, the legal protections around posthumous data aren't the same. So that data then might be an asset for a country for a company that then can release that data once someone dies, and there's less barriers potentially in place. So it can be used in that way. So it becomes very unruly, but it has a less value maybe in terms of someone who has died's profile, for example, on Facebook, won't carry any ads or anything. So, but you could argue that it's to keep people around the platform. But that data still does have a value separate from that. And if you can have someone's entire life as a data set, there is either one end of it commercially, which mightn't be the most ethically sound use of it, but also then learning in terms of a holistic view of someone's life and the factors using that to train that AI model. Absolutely, there's potential real good can come from that too.
Right. Okay. And I assume that AI can be used to interrogate posthumous data as well. If there's a lot of it, that's probably something that's going to become more common. Yeah,
absolutely. And will be a great strength of AI, is the potential for recognizing these patterns that in such a large volume that may not otherwise be recognizable.
And tell us a bit more about the research that you're doing as part of your PhD. What kind of projects have you been doing to explore these issues?
So I kind of try and focus on different methods for how we can unpack these ethical issues, because it's so vast and it's ambiguous and amorphous and very difficult to get a grasp on. So I've tried to create interactions and tangible scenarios how we can start doing it. So one of the first ones I did was this idea of a data donation card. So akin to organ donation, but giving people the agency to select types of data that they'd be willing to share after death, and seeing what types of data people would be willing to share, why they might be comfortable, who they'd be willing to share it with. And the idea behind the data donor card is using basically the metaphor of the organ donor card, but bringing it into as a tangible thing, that putting a frame on it and allowing conversations to happen and getting more specific questions, as opposed to going, what would you like to happen with your data after you die?
And what did you find when people thought about this data donor card, or they started to think about how theirs might look?
Well, this is the thing, that it does throw up interesting questions. A lot of people like, once I'm dead, I won't care. And then sometimes we kind of dot, unless it affects anyone I know. And then it goes, okay, but if you're donating genetic information, in the realest sense, it's tied to people you know and are related to. And as certain as death will happen, also we all have relatives, and those things are pretty straightforward. So how that's used, and this comes back to AI, once the genetic information is available, it's like with 23andMe being sold, this is where the value of the data, and what I'm looking into is the values of data. So whether it's monetary or it's to do with dignity, what value are we placing on different types of data? And it's not about coming to an answer where we can control it all, because that mightn't be desirable either. It's about gaining an understanding of what people's values are in relation to that data. So obviously a big thing that would come up, there is a lean towards, for medical research, people are more willing, but then you start asking what types of data, because ideally for an AI system, they'd want every single piece of data, and medical data becomes a very loose term. So social media posts could entirely be relevant, but we wouldn't consider that medical data. But maybe if it's health data or smartwatch data or whatever it may be, all that's desirable, but where the lines are and what's reasonable to want to feed those systems is unclear at the moment. So that's one project that's kind of ongoing at the moment.
Very good. And you've also made this very tangible personal computer to help people to really sort of see things in action, haven't you?
Yeah, so this was kind of an attempt from after the data donation card, which is very broad and can be seen as a kind of a decision you could make. And it is something that is being called for, this idea of medical data donation. But then the personal computer, I wanted to, in a way, have people spend more time with an interaction. So I got a laptop and I've populated it with various types of data, whether that's medical scans, emails, I've set up accounts, and essentially it's presented as belonging to someone who has recently died. And it offers an opportunity for people to sit down at that laptop, go through the accounts, go through the files to see what they're comfortable with, maybe what they're not comfortable with, going through what the assumptions they're making. So I have like their Google Calendar filled out. It stops at a certain date. Then there's also voice recordings, voice memos, the family history. I have a genetic testing for this person. Their email account is active. I've actually not touched it in a few weeks because I'm kind of curious to go back in and revisit and see what's happened. So even their Spotify playlist is constantly playing and the algorithm's feeding itself. And so it gives people an opportunity to go, okay, this is some of it's real data, some of it's generated data. So, and it's kind of a research through design process. So as much as people looking into it's my own assumptions as well, and what happened with it. And the first thing that was very noticeable was initially the idea was to make it very neutral, not have a person attached to it. But that was actually not possible because as soon as I opened the laptop, they're like, create an Apple ID. So I had to do it. And then even the passwords and all those kind of things. And there are little things that are all linked together, but in a loose way. So there's enough ambiguity so people can fill in those gaps.
So I'm thinking, Danny, of how you came up with this persona of the person who died. How did you do that? Was that an emotional process for you? Did you feel like you got to know them as you created this profile?
Well, yes and no. So there was some practical things. I gave them the same birthday as me for the reason so I could remember it. And because as I signed up to accounts, so I created lots of different accounts for these people, and just purely so I wouldn't lose them and remember them. I wanted to give them with its starting point of this neutral, ambiguous person, but that came kind of impossible. But I gave them the name Alex White, and just as a kind of a neutral name. But then you start thinking about, okay, there is reasons behind all these decisions. And I never felt the person didn't become real, but I did create like an Instagram account, and they have a profile picture, and they follow people and people follow them. And there is a bit of a blurring of a line because there's lots of photos included that would have been from my life. There's anonymized things. There's things like baby scans in there, and the voice notes are artificially generated. It's kind of playing that line, and you don't want to make it, I wanted to make it realistic, but have a tinge of uncanniness, but without it being a kind of purely novelty. This is, because the word that comes up most frequently is creepy when you talk about any of this stuff.
Right. Yeah. Wow. And you were involved in the ethics studio recently at the Beta Fest in the Beta Festival in Dublin. Tell us a little bit more about that. And did you learn much about people's perception of all this digital legacy?
It was really interesting. So I had the laptop set up there. People really spent a lot of time with the laptop. So quite often, like around 20 minutes or so, just sitting, exploring different laptops. I have headphones set up to just so the playlist that Spotify is generating based on the initial 10 liked songs or whatever is going. And people are some people kind of approach it like they're trying to work things out. So they're going into the calendar and going into the medical diary, going into the scans, all those types of things.
Okay.
And trying to connect dots. Others did just say they found it quite emotional and they sat with it, because there's also a stillness to it or something that as you're there going through, and it does feel intrusive away as much as it's not. It does offer, I think there is a real argument for the necessity of something like that, a space and an opportunity to reflect in a prolonged way that's beyond just a question. So it is really making that intangible idea tangible.
Right. And can you talk to us a little about the role of design in making sure that individuals can leave behind sort of a meaningful and accessible digital footprint?
One of the big issues is that we don't necessarily understand, and I'm saying I don't understand what my digital footprint encompasses. And with a small bit of thing, you start thinking like even just the infrastructures we use of, say, Google, which would compromise my personal email, my work email, all that, my calendar, all that's within that ecosystem. So having sort of a legacy contact in place for that is fine. But there's also obviously other things so maybe the big companies have made efforts. I'm not here to defend them in any way, but there are opportunities to create the legacy contacts. And hands up, I haven't done it. And there is a barrier because it's the same way people don't create wills typically, but like until you're of a certain age, obviously the percentage increases, but even then it's not a given that someone will do it. So it's not about, I can't really see how design of anything will cover everything. So maybe there has to come from a bit of a drive from by identifying the values of these different types of data, people pushing for it. And the strongest way to do that is commercially. So sticking within maybe platforms that facilitate control of data, and even not, and really when we're talking about posthumous data, it's kind of reflecting back on our just data practices during our life. but it's kind of just a point to sort of show this is obviously where that data ends. So how we do it, we're also creating data for future generations, and what all those kind of things are important.
And what would your top tip be, I suppose, for all of us, what we should be doing now to ensure that our digital legacy is left as we would like it to be?
Well, a simple thing is to create those legacy contacts on your Meta accounts, Google, Apple. And I would see that just as a purely practical situation. So you're not leaving people with those decisions. And those things are important to people. And I've been thinking a lot about how I kind of ended up looking into this area. And there's been little sort of points to life. And I worked for a mobile phone company many, many years ago. But one of the most common calls, I'm not saying it was every day, but it happened quite a lot, was someone ringing in who had lost access to typically their child's voicemail. And what they would do is ring up and hear the message. And then the way it worked is phone numbers would get recycled after a certain amount of time. So it would be assigned to someone else. So therefore the voicemail goes. And it shows the importance. So it's not about some idea of a AI avatar encompassing the person. There's small little things, and it can be difficult for people not to have access to those things. So having just small housekeeping of, okay, well, within this profile, I will make sure that it's accessible if you want it accessible. If not, make sure you don't do that and you delete it.
Wow, so much to think about. It's a fascinating topic, and thank you so much, Danny Snow, for joining us today. And if you would like to find out more about Danny's work and ADAPT's research more generally, you can find lots of information in the show notes and at www.adaptcentre.ie. That's it for our podcast this time round. Until next time, from myself, Claire O'Connell, Slán, and thanks for listening.
The Adapt Radio podcast is brought to you by the Adapt Centre at Trinity College Dublin. Find out more about their extensive research work at adaptcentre.ie. Join us next time to hear about more groundbreaking innovations. To get new episodes automatically, just click the follow button on your player right now. The Adapt Radio podcast is produced by dustpod.io, with episodes monthly on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts.